Hello everybody, it's Kara from Wild Book Garden, and today I'm here with my February wrap-up. I didn't read quite as many books in February as I have been, so I'm deciding to do this all in one part. Also, before we get started, I am very sorry for the lighting. I'm hoping it's not too bad or too distracting. I'm filming much later than I usually do. The first book I finished in February is The Legendary Miss Lena Horne by Carol Boston Weatherford, art by Elizabeth Sunan. And this is a picture book about Lena Horne, about her life. She was a famous singer. Here is what the art style looks like. It's kind of like, it reminds me almost of like paper cutouts. I really liked it. It was really colorful and I just really liked the design. I really enjoyed this. I thought this was an absolutely wonderful picture book. I really like that we got to learn about Lena Horne's life and her civil rights activism, and of course her singing career as well, and what music meant to her. I just thought this was really beautiful. I would highly recommend it. I'm definitely excited to learn more about Lena Horne now because I really knew very little about her before picking this up, and I gave The Legendary Miss Lena Horne 5 stars. Next, I finished Uncomfortable Conversations with a Black Man by Emmanuel Acho. It's kind of a basic introduction to race in the US, specifically anti-blackness in the US. When I rate and review nonfiction books like this, especially when they're on a topic like this, I don't rate on like how groundbreaking the ideas are, because I don't think that's what the book is attempting to do. Now, if it was like a nonfiction book that part of the like marketing or part of the like promise of the book was like new information or like these are completely new ideas, then yes, I might take that into consideration. But when it's something like this and that's not the intent, I don't consider that in my rating or review, because the reason I don't do that is because then my ratings for these different books would just be based on which ones I happen to read first, which I don't think would be a fair way to review them. So anyway, I thought this was really great. I thought the writing was really engaging. This is definitely intended to be a very approachable book on race. I think this would be like a good like starter one, but I still think that even if you are familiar with some of these conversations, you could still get a lot out of it. I think with a lot of these books, just because you know like the information or some of the points that the authors are going to make, you can still get things out of them because of specific examples or data points or phrasings for things. And also, so Emmanuel Acho, he apparently has a YouTube channel that I think is called Uncomfortable Conversations with a Black Man or something like that. And he's also apparently a professional football player. So this is structured in like different chapters, and each chapter is an uncomfortable conversation or an uncomfortable question that somebody would ask a Black man. And like he's taking the role of answering those questions. And something else I really love is that at the end of each chapter, he gives specific action examples, like specific like things that you can do right away on how to work towards creating a more just society, which I really appreciated. Acho also uses a lot of personal examples from his life. Like he talks about a lot of interactions he's had on football teams, which I thought was interesting. I'm not a sports person, but I still found those provided like a really interesting kind of example of what he was talking about. He was also very honest in this book. Like there were a few times where he would talk about his own judgments that he had made or prejudices that he had, and would kind of like unpack those and address those. And another interesting thing about this book is at least part of it was written last year, so in 2020. And so there are quite a few parts in this book that specifically address the murders that took place last summer. And so Acho would actually mention by name and discuss by name people like George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery. And I think that specificity lent a lot to this book. He also talks about the pandemic and things related to that. Like I think he did a really great job of making this timeless and also very timely, like very specific when he needed to be. And yeah, I just thought this was really great. The only like minor thing I want to mention that I didn't love is like not at all related to the content, but I did mention that this book was partially written during the time of the pandemic. So he talks about like, you know, wearing masks and having to cancel in-person events and things like that, which I think is good. And then at the end he mentions like having going to a masked party and everyone took their masks off for like just a few minutes to take a photo or something, which like I just thought that was kind of weird. Just that's not a good practice, like don't do that. So I wish he hadn't put that in the book. I wish he hadn't done that. But otherwise I thought this was really great. And again, that doesn't like take away from the content of this book. I just thought it was interesting that he made such a point of talking about the precautions everybody was taking earlier in the book, and then there was that one thing that I thought was kind of weird. But yeah, I thought this was really great, and I gave Uncomfortable Conversations with a Black Man 5 stars. Next, I finished another nonfiction book, and that is The Woman's Hour, The Great Fight to Win the Vote by Elaine Weiss. And this is a nonfiction book about the 19th Amendment in the United States and about the fight for women's suffrage in the US. And specifically, a lot of this book focuses on kind of the final ratification fight in Tennessee, which for those who don't know, Tennessee was the last state that was required to ratify the 19th Amendment in order to make it the law of the land. If a certain proportion of states voted yes on the amendment, then it would become part of the Constitution and every state in the US would have to abide by it. So there was a lot at stake here. And I really liked this. I thought this was really, really well written. I think it's a real testament to Elaine Weiss's writing skill that she is able to take a historical event that, like, we know what happened. Like, we know it turns out okay and that the amendment passes, but she was able to turn this into a nail biter. Like, this was very compelling. It was very, at times, stressful to read about. It was infuriating because some of the chapters we focus on specific leaders of the movement, like of the suffrage movement or of the anti-suffrage movement, and it was just like gross being in some of these people's heads, or not like in their heads, but like following them specifically and talking about what they believed and what they were doing. I really liked how this book focused so much on that fight in Tennessee, because that's obviously like a big thing that gets talked about a lot for the American suffrage movement in that era, but there was a lot more detail given to it here than most sources tend to, and I really enjoyed that. I've now read several books on the women's suffrage movement in the US, and I really appreciate getting to learn more detailed things about some of the events that we talk about in broader terms. I think this book does a really excellent job of showing what a close call it was. And again, that's part of what made this book very stressful to read, but I think that's really important to see and to recognize that this was not an inevitable thing that was going to happen. It happened because people worked really hard for a really long time. And I also think that, like, one of the things I really enjoyed about this book, and this has happened in several other of the nonfiction books I've read on suffrage, but I really like those little details, like those little moments, like people who don't get like a whole biography about them, but like you still see their contribution. Like, there was one story I remember, I think it was in this book, they were talking about I don't know if it was the first or second time that the amendment passed in Congress, but one congressman, he had left the assembly to go be with his wife on her deathbed, and she made him go back. Like, she made him leave her so that he could be there to vote in favor of women getting the right to vote. And he came back to her funeral. And that's just like pretty amazing, and I just like learning about those people along the way who were part of this and who, again, like, they don't get long biographies about them, but they were extremely important. And I think this book does a good job of balancing those things where, like, it talks about some of the influential people in the movement, it talks about some of the, like, moments when it came down to one person or one decision, but it also shows how the whole movement was made up of things like that. I also thought it was really interesting that this book talked a lot about the South pro-suffrage movement in particular, and how like a lot of the suffragists in the US had kind of given up on the southern states, and they were like, well, they're never going to get on board, like there's no point even recruiting there or like putting advertisements there or anything like that. And this book shows how there were still like women who were working on the ground there and who did a lot, who accomplished a lot. I also liked that we got to see a little bit of the aftermath, and the way this book was structured was kind of interesting because the majority of it was sort of a narrative style about like what was happening in Tennessee, kind of like what led up to that, why this was so important, and then the actual fight there. And so like a lot of the book was that. There would also be chapters that focus more on specific people, which I thought was interesting. I do think that like some of those maybe could have been cut a little bit, but overall, I did really enjoy this. If you're not American, or if you don't have a specific interest in the American suffrage movement, I'm not sure how, like, if you would enjoy this as much as I did, but I don't know for sure. I just want to mention that this is very situated in the American context. I would be very interested to hear, though, if you have read this one and you're not American, or like you don't have a specific interest in that, like in the US suffrage movement, like, did you enjoy this? Do you feel like you still got a lot out of it? I would be very curious to know. And I gave The Woman's Hour 4 stars. Next, I finished The Broken Kingdoms by N.K. Jemisin. This is the second book in the Inheritance trilogy, and this is actually a companion sequel, so it does take place after the events of the first book, but we are following a different main character, and her name is Ori, and she is a blind artist, and this is also in a different setting than the first book is. And I can't tell you too much about the premise because I don't want to spoil events of the first book, but basically, so Ori is one of our main characters, and then kind of one of our other main characters is somebody that we know from the first book who has had their situation drastically change, and so we're seeing them kind of like navigate this setting that they're unfamiliar with. So this is a very different story than the first book. So not only do we follow different main characters, but the focus is kind of different. This book it has a pretty significant murder mystery element, or at least that's kind of what sets off a lot of the events of this book. So these godlings start dying, they just like turn up dead, and everybody is really scared. They don't know who's doing this or like why this is happening. And Ori and this other main character and some other people as well are kind of trying to figure out like what's going on, like who is killing the godlings. And then they also end up getting tangled up in the politics of this world as they try to figure out what's going on. And yeah, again, I really can't summarize a lot about this one, but as for how I felt about it, I did really enjoy it. I didn't love it quite as much as book one, just because I really loved the 100,000 Kingdoms, and there were a few things about this one that I personally found a little less compelling. Like, I did really enjoy Ori as a main character, but I didn't love her like I did Lena in the first book. And also just the plot of this one, like the political stuff in this book was definitely interesting, but I didn't find it as compelling as the political things happening in the first book. I did find the other main character very interesting though, and kind of like what they were navigating in this book. Like, I thought that was a really interesting idea. And I ended up like really being invested in them as a character. I also found the new setting of this one really interesting. I really enjoyed some of the side characters as well, and I did definitely get very invested in this story. Like, I really wanted to know like who was responsible for these deaths, what was going on. Again, I was interested in the politics, I just wasn't quite as invested as I was in book one. There was also a kind of like past romantic relationship that is sort of important for part of this book, and it definitely didn't take over the story, but I just didn't care about it at all, and I give The Broken Kingdoms 4 stars. The next book I finished was The Memory of Babel by Christelle Debo, translated by Hildegard Searle, and I received this copy in exchange for an honest review from the publisher, so thank you so much. And I do actually have a whole separate review on this book, so I will link that down below. It is spoiler free, but this series is set in this world where there are different floating arcs, and the people in these worlds have like different, or the people in these arcs have different abilities, and our main character Ophelia, she has the ability to read objects, so she can put her hands on them and like kind of see the object's past, see the past even of like people who have interacted with the object. And at the beginning of the first book, she is kind of sent off for a political marriage to this man named Horne, who is part of a different arc, and like so many things happen from there. This third book, I'm gonna give like a very brief summary. So we're following Ophelia mainly by herself this time, and she's on a different arc now called Babel, and some time has passed since the end of the second book, and she's trying to track down a certain character, and she thinks that Babel might have some information about kind of like the overarching plot stuff that is going on. I did really enjoy this one. I didn't like it as much as books 1 or 2. I gave this 3.75 stars, and the other 2 books I gave 4 stars. I think the second book is my favorite so far. So I did really love the world. I thought Babel was such an interesting setting. I just think that Christelle Debo is such a creative writer. I really liked some of the side characters as well. I also just really, really love Horne as a character. His and Ophelia's dynamic is just really, really interesting, and I really like it. I'm very invested in their relationship. And just Horne as a character. Like, I remember when he was first introduced in the first book, I was not a fan of his, and now I love him so much, and I just want him to be okay. And yeah, like now I want him and Ophelia to be okay. I found Ophelia a less compelling character in this one. I didn't like her like I did in the first couple books, and not because I disliked her, I just felt kind of neutral about her. And then something that I've said throughout the series, but I think is even more true in this book, is I just do not care about the overarching plot. I am just so much more invested in these characters and in the like smaller story elements going on. Like book 2, I think one of the reasons it was my favorite is because there was kind of a mystery aspect, and the like court politics was really fascinating, and like I like the individual, like again, like the smaller plot stuff, not so much the overarching plot, and it is just getting very, very convoluted. Like I do appreciate that there is a section at the beginning of this book kind of summarizing things that have happened, but they can't summarize everything, and I just feel like too much is happening. I feel like the reveals, some of them didn't really make sense. And again, like just interest-wise, I don't really care about the big plot stuff. I am just really invested in these characters and in the other plot things going on. So anyway, if you want more detailed thoughts, even though I have been talking for a while already, again, check out that review, but I did enjoy this. It just wasn't my favorite in the series. And then next I finished another review copy, and that is Real by Carol Kujek and Peyton Goddard. Again, I did a whole spoiler-free review on this book, which I will link down below. This book is about our main character, Charity, who has non-speaking autism, and she also, she can't always control the movements of her body, and so for these reasons, she's been put into a like special learning facility that is just really, really horrible. They really mistreat the kids there, and Charity's not given any opportunity to really learn, like people aren't taking care of her there. And so most of this book is about Charity fighting for the right to have an actual education, like to actually be given the opportunity to learn, because everybody in the school system has basically made this judgment that Charity can't learn anything, so there's no point teaching her. This book is also inspired by the true story of Peyton Goddard. So one of the authors is autistic. She has non-speaking autism, and a lot of this book is inspired by her specific experiences. And I ended up like really liking this book. I really liked Charity as a character. I really liked the kind of more subtle themes in this book. I do wish that there had been more time spent on these, but I really liked that they were included in this book, and that is that, one, intelligence should not be the determining factor of a person being treated decently. Like, so much of this book, Charity spends fighting for her right to have a real education and proving that she's smart, but she also says a few times throughout the book that it shouldn't be this way. Like, that she shouldn't have to prove that she has a certain level or kind of intelligence in order to be treated with the care and love that she deserves, that everyone deserves. So I really liked that, and I also really liked enjoyed, but I thought it was really important. This book shows that neurodivergent people or people with disabilities don't just prove once that they are like worthy of time or attention or resources or whatever. It's a continuous process. Like, Charity has to constantly fight to prove to people that she deserves to be at this school, that she deserves to be treated like a person. And so I thought that was really important as well, that it's like this ongoing battle because of the ableist society that we live in. I also really liked some of the side characters and the emphasis on friendship. I really love, like, you see in this book how having caregivers who are trained to give these kids the chance that they deserve, like to interact with kids in particular ways. Like, having people who are trained to do this makes such a massive difference in these kids' lives. As far as the negatives, I do think that the ending wrapped up a little too quickly and with too few of consequences for certain people. And I also think that Charity was maybe a little too forgiving of some of the characters in this book, which is something that other reviewers I think mention as well. And I also, speaking of reviewers, in my review video, like, I am not an Own Voices reviewer, but I do link a few Own Voices reviews I have been able to find on Goodreads. It seems like overall the response for the representation has been pretty positive, but since filming that video I also found a couple that talk a little bit more about the negative aspects of the representation in addition to the positive ones. So I do just encourage you to seek out Own Voices reviews, and I gave Real 4 stars. Next, I finished our Past It Classics pick for the month, and that was East of Eden by John Steinbeck. As you can see by the tabs, lots to unpack and discuss in this book. The live show was hosted on Julia's channel. Julia and Taylor and I had such a good time discussing the positives and negatives of this book. I will link that video down below. But yeah, like, where even to begin? So East of Eden is a like sweeping kind of epic story, and it mainly follows 2 families in the Salinas Valley in California, and like a few different generations of these families and their lives. I'll say off the bat, my rating ended up in the middle for this book. I gave it 3 stars, but it's one of those 3-star books where I'm not neutral about it. It's like there were 5-star aspects of this book and 1-star aspects of this book. So averaged together, that's a 3-star review, or that's a 3-star rating. And yeah, like, I just had so many mixed feelings about this book because some things I loved about it. Like, I really, really loved the writing. It was so beautiful and evocative and emotional. This is the 4th Steinbeck book that I've read, and I don't remember any of his other novels having this. This is definitely the Steinbeck book I've had the most positive experience with, even though this was still mixed. But yeah, I just thought the writing was gorgeous. I also really loved the setting, and something we talked a little bit about. So I live in California, if you guys don't know that, and I did not anticipate how moving and fulfilling it would be to see the place that I lived romanticized, or like talked so beautifully about. Like, that was just really, really lovely. And I don't live anywhere near the Salinas Valley, but I do live in California. So some of the sites and some of the things that he talks about, I'm like, I know these things. And seeing them described with such love and care and beauty was just really lovely. Like, there's this one quote about the poppies. Like, he's talking about California poppies, which if you haven't seen them, they're absolutely gorgeous. I'll put a couple pictures up. So he's describing the flowers. And mixed with these were splashes of California poppies. These 2 are of a burning color, not orange, not gold, but if pure gold were liquid and could raise a cream, that golden cream might be like the color of the poppies. Like, just some of the descriptions in this book were absolutely stunning. I really loved some of the themes in this book about free will. This is also an incredibly compelling book to read, which I did not expect it to be, because again, I have not enjoyed John Steinbeck in the past. Like, I would sit down to read a little bit and I would just end up reading a big chunk because I was just so invested in these characters and in the story, and again, I was loving the writing so much. And like, speaking of the characters, I just really, really loved some of them. Including a couple, like, I got very invested in a couple of characters who I didn't think I would. Like, I didn't really like them at the beginning, but their growth was just so well done. Their development was so interesting and so compelling. Some of the female characters in this book are absolutely fantastic. So I don't know what happened, because there are other parts of this book where the female portrayal is just like atrocious. So I don't know, but there's like a few different female characters in this novel that are just so rich and so complex and so well written, and it's like, I don't understand how John Steinbeck could write these women and then write some of the other female characters that he does. It's like, how is this the same guy writing these? And then as for the things that I did not like about this book, basically it comes down to the racism, the misogyny, and Kathy, who is one of the female characters. And I just despised her. I don't think she was very, like, she was a huge chunk of the book, but she really didn't need to be. Like, honestly, like, she did not have to have as prominent a role as she did for the story to work and like for the same story to happen. And I just like, I hated her scenes. I hated her as a character. I also, it's actually kind of similar to how we felt about Milady in the Three Musketeers, in that I hated her, but I also hated that by hating her, I was agreeing with some of the men in the book. Like, so like the example I gave in our live show is, it's like John Steinbeck creates this character who is a horrible human being, which is Kathy, and she happens to be a woman. He creates this character and is like, look, isn't she awful? And I'm reading the book and I'm like, yes, she's awful. And he's like, aren't all women awful? And I'm like, no, that's not how that works. And it really felt like that's what he was trying to say at some points. Yeah, so like, I hated Kathy. She was a huge like negative for this book for me. I just hated the misogyny in general. Like, again, it was so weird because some of the female characters were so fantastic, and then sometimes there were these really awful, like awfully developed female characters, and just like sometimes the perspectives on women were really messed up. And then there was also a lot of racism in this book. Like both like racist language and racist ideas, racist characters, like there was a lot. Like even for a classic, I think this had a lot. Although it was interesting because there's one Chinese character named Lee who all of us in the live show loved. I think everyone who was reading the book with us really loved him as well. And he was such an interesting case because there were some things about him that were like kind of stereotypical, but you meet him and you think he's gonna be this very like offensive stereotype of a Chinese character. And then Steinbeck kind of flips it. And he is such a fantastic character. I think Lee as a character brought up some really interesting ideas. I think in a lot of ways, his character played against a lot of the racist stereotypes and tropes. But on the other hand, there were other parts of this book that were like extremely racist. So just like be aware going into this one. And as always, I put all the content warnings I can think of down below in the description, so check that out. Yes, this was a very complicated reading experience. Like some of the themes in this book, like some of the sections on grief, like there's this one that like was very emotional to read that's like about how two characters, they're husband and wife, and they lose one of their children. And the husband is like really angry, and it's almost like he never really, like the book says, it's almost like he never really believed in death until it happened to somebody he cares about. So he's just like angry, and like he just like shuts down basically. Like he can't like function normally. And his wife continues to function. Like she's taking care of people, she's making the funeral arrangements, and the book makes the point that she doesn't love her child less. And I just thought that was like so beautiful and so profound. And like there's scenes and lines in this book that I think I'm gonna think about for a long time. So yeah, there were so many things that I really loved about this book. There were some really big things that I didn't. It was just a very, very mixed bag. I think in my Goodreads review, I said that like all of my emotions were like put in a blender, and it's like I'm just like a very confused emotional smoothie now because like just such mixed feelings. Anyway, I'm gonna stop rambling about that one now. But it was an experience. Next, I finished As Brave as You by Jason Reynolds. This is an interesting book to summarize because the synopsis on Goodreads talks about something that doesn't happen until like a big chunk of the book is over, which is usually, I think, not a good choice, but I kind of understand why they wanted to mention that because like it does color a lot of the book, but I also don't know if I should give that away. So anyway, feel free to check out the Goodreads summary. We are following our main character Jeannie, and him and his older brother Ernie get sent to Virginia to stay with their grandparents for the summer. And this book, like the first part of it is really like very slice of life, and like we're just getting to, like we're spending time with Jeannie and Ernie, like we're seeing them kind of adjust to living in this very different environment because they're from New York City. and like getting to know their grandparents more. So Jeannie realizes that his grandfather is blind, and so he starts getting to know him more and getting closer to him. And a really big theme of this book is bravery and what bravery can look like. And then, as I said, like near the middle of this book, there's a pretty significant thing that happens that makes Ernie... I'm sorry, I feel like this is the wrap-up of incredibly vague summaries because, like, I really don't know how much I should say about like what actually happens in this book, especially since the summaries don't seem to agree on what you should know going into this book. But basically, Ernie gets the opportunity to do something that Jeannie is really excited about and thinks is fun, but Ernie doesn't want to. And that also kind of brings up these ideas of what does bravery mean? And so that's kind of like the focus of the book. We also see Jeannie and Ernie like making friends, like meeting people, again, getting to know their grandparents better. And we also learn a lot more about Jeannie and Ernie's family, like not just their grandparents, but Jeannie and Ernie's dad, because these grandparents are on their dad's side, and kind of some things that happened in their past, and just like learning more about their family history and things that happened. And as with all of Jason Reynolds' books, I did really enjoy this one. I really loved Jeannie as a main character. He has such a strong voice, and he has this thing where like he really likes questions. He really likes learning the answers to questions, I should say. And so he writes them down and he'll end up looking them up on the computer. And those questions were, I think, a really fun and clever way to almost make parts of this book feel like a diary. I just thought that was a really interesting device. I liked that in the writing. I loved the brother relationship between Jeannie and Ernie, like the way that they loved each other and teased each other, and the way that Ernie looked out for his younger brother. Like those were just, I just really loved that aspect of the book. I really enjoyed some of the side characters as well. And I also think Jason Reynolds did such an amazing job of kind of making you see where everyone was coming from, almost everyone. So I just think that's a mark of how great Jason Reynolds is at characters. I really like the themes of this book. Again, like bravery is a big one and how that can look different. Also themes of family and like forgiveness and generational trauma, and also how things, this is gonna be hard to explain again without spoilers, but like things that meant one thing in the past, like things that meant protection or safety in the past, can mean something different now. Like I thought that aspect was so interesting and so well done in this book. The only real negatives I would say about this book are there's a few things that felt kind of unfinished to me, or like a little unresolved. And I think some of them kind of make sense because, again, this is sort of a slice of life book in a way. So it's like you're just looking at this snapshot of these kids' lives and like of this one summer that they spend with their grandparents. So like, yeah, not everything is going to be wrapped up in this one summer. But there were a couple of places where I'm like, okay, but I feel like this would be a good time to explain to the kids, like here's how to take care of animals, or like this is an example of how adults can be wrong about things too, and here's why this was wrong and things like that. So not that like the story should have stopped so we could have like a teaching moment for the kids or anything, but there were a couple of big things like that where I think it would have still fit in with the story, and I would maybe have liked to see those issues directly addressed in the book. But overall, I thought this was a really great book, and I gave As Brave as You 4 stars. Next, I finished The Halcyon Fairy book by T. Kingfisher, and this is actually a kind of bind-up. So the first half is a collection of annotated fairy tales that T. Kingfisher, I think she originally did them on her blog or her author website, and then they're collected in this book. And then the second half of this book is her Toad Words anthology, which are her original like fairy tale retellings that she wrote. And this was very, very kindly sent to me by somebody on Twitter, because it's actually like you can't really find like a physical copy of this book anymore. Like it's like really hard to get your hands on. And when I mentioned that I was having a hard time finding it, a very, very kind person on Twitter offered to send me an extra copy, which was just like so wonderful of them, and I'm so grateful, and I really enjoyed this. T. Kingfisher is definitely one of my favorite fantasy writers. I have talked about her before, and just like as somebody who enjoys reading fairy tales and folklore type things, it was so fascinating to see these weird fairy tales that she had collected and annotated, because she picked like the strange ones because she didn't intend, like T. Kingfisher did not intend to make this like a running thing on her blog, but it's like she had read a fairy tale that was just so bananas that she like had to basically share it and talk about it. So she picked like very odd or unique or interesting fairy tales, and they're just like so wild. Like some of them were just like so weird. But again, like very fascinating to read if you are somebody who is interested in that kind of thing, which I am. I do think that if you are looking to get into T. Kingfisher, this is maybe not a good book to start with, just because I think her writing comes through much more clearly in her longer works. Like, for example, I really love the humor in her books, and even though there is some humor in the annotations she's doing, I don't think it's as good a reflection of how clever and funny she can be. Like the humor in those, and like the annotated parts sometimes got a little bit repetitive or a little bit like, yeah, okay, I get it. Whereas in her novels, I really enjoy her humor. But if you are already a fan, or again, if you are somebody who is just really fascinated by the idea of like reading these weird fairy tales, then I think you would really enjoy it. And I did really love her own like spins, like her own retellings of fairy tales that are the Toadwords anthology. I really enjoyed a lot of those. I love her writing, I love her characters, I love the way that she can create characters and get you so invested in them so quickly, even in some of these very, very short stories. There's a version of Little Red Riding Hood that I thought was really great, like really interesting. There was a Peter Pan retelling that was like not my favorite, just because I think T. Kingfisher and I have different ideas of like the themes of Peter Pan, but like it was still very well written and everything. And definitely my favorite retelling in here is the last one, which is a take on Snow White. Let me see what it's called. It's called Boar and Apples. And I loved that. That is possibly my favorite Snow White retelling ever now. It's also the longest story in this collection, and just like the characterization, the writing, like the animal companions elements, or not even companions, but like animal characters. I feel like I'm very picky about animal characters, but like hers are so good. I always love them. So yeah, I really enjoyed this. I gave the Halcyon Fairy book 4 stars. Again, I am so grateful that I actually had the opportunity to read this. And finally, the last book I finished in February, I actually like technically finished it after midnight, so this should be the first book I finished in March, but I'm gonna count it for February because it was barely after midnight. And that is Gone Crazy in Alabama by Rita Williams Garcia. This is the third and final book in the Gaither Sisters series, which is a trilogy, and this series is just so underhyped, so well done. Again, shout out to Ashley from Book of Sham who like put this series on my radar. By the way, I should have mentioned that the first book is called One Crazy Summer. So we are following the Gaither sisters, and our main character is the oldest. Her name is Delphine, and her younger sisters, Vonetta and Fern. The 3 sisters go to Alabama to stay with their grandmother and their great-grandmother, and they end up finding out some things about the rivalry between their great-grandmother and this other family, this other like woman's family specifically. And it was just such a brilliant book. Like, this might be my favorite in the trilogy, even though like there are parts of this book that are definitely not fun to read. It's just like such a well done story. Like the way this book deals with like family and like generational trauma and racism and these like really heavy topics. It's just done in such a thoughtful way. Like as Delphine is like starting to put the pieces together about what is actually going on, like why these 2 families are estranged, like following that is just, it's very compelling because like you want to know what's going on, and it's just like so well done. And like again, like the themes and the ideas that tie into the story, like they're just like so well written. Another thing I think this book did brilliantly is show Delphine realizing that the adults around her don't always know best, or like don't always act in a way that is right. Like she's watching this feud, and here's this like, how old is she? 11, I think, 11 or 12-year-old girl who can see that these adults are being ridiculous, and like that this vendetta makes no sense. And like seeing Delphine realize that like sometimes adults can be very childish too, that was just really interesting to see. And also seeing Delphine realize that like adults sometimes make compromises. Like they teach her right and wrong, but then sometimes they're like, well, you have to behave this way even though it's not right because it means like staying safe and surviving. Like Delphine realizing that they have to be friendly to somebody who they know is in the KKK, and they can't act like they know this, and like seeing Delphine realize that is just like heartbreaking. Also on the character front, I think like Rita Williams Garcia is so good at writing like messy characters and like complicated characters and relationships and dynamics, and like for example, in this book, for a lot of it, Vonetta was getting on my last nerve. Like the middle sister, like just the way she was behaving and like the things that she was doing, and it's like, you know, she's young, so it's not like unreasonable that she would be behaving this way, but it's like even when you're like, okay, you know now that what you're doing is wrong, you know what the consequences are, and like she just was such a frustrating character sometimes, but then there were other times where she wasn't like frustrating and she wasn't like that. Anyway, obviously I thought this book was brilliant. I gave Gone Crazy in Alabama 5 stars. Okay everybody, so those are all of the books I read in February. I have been filming for so long and I haven't even started editing, and I already hate myself for how much I talk. But I hope that you enjoyed this. Please comment down below and let me know if you have read any of these books, what you thought of them, or if you're going to pick them up. Thank you guys so much for watching. I will see you soon with another video, and I hope you love the next book you read. Bye!